A diver descended to 82 meters off the coast of Nova Scotia in July of 2004, and what he saw when he got there stopped him cold. The submarine was sitting on the bottom almost exactly as it had gone down 62 years earlier. Hatches sealed, deck gun still in position, and through the opening of one of the vertical mine tubes, the cover blown off, probably by a depth charge, he could see directly inside the hull, a German naval mine, still there. Sitting in its tube like it had been loaded yesterday, armed and ready, waiting for a port it never reached. 48 men are still inside that submarine. They have been there since July 3, 1942. No one ever came for them. By the time this is over, you will know exactly what that submarine was trying to do, why it never made it, how a team of divers found it 6 decades later using fishermen's net snags and oceanographic survey records, and why what they discovered when they finally got inside changes the way you think about the Battle of the Atlantic in the waters right off the coast of North America, closer to Boston than most people realize. But before we get to the discovery, there is something about this particular submarine that almost nobody mentions when they tell this story. Something about what it was built to do that makes it unlike nearly any other German U-boat of the entire war. I'll get to that. First, you need to understand what was happening in the summer of 1942 off the American coast, because without that context, the story of U-215 is just a wreck on the bottom of the sea. With it, it becomes something considerably darker. In the first 8 months of 1942, German submarines sank more Allied shipping than in any comparable period of the entire war. Admiral Karl Dönitz had opened a campaign against the American and Canadian coasts in January of that year, Operation Paukenschlag, Drumbeat, and the results were catastrophic. American harbor lights hadn't been blacked out yet. Ships were still silhouetting themselves against city lights on the horizon, making them easy targets. The Coast Guard was unprepared. The Navy was stretched thin, and German U-boats were sinking ships so fast, so close to shore, that beaches in New Jersey and Florida were washing up oil slicks and wreckage and bodies. By the time summer arrived, U-boats had sunk over 300 Allied ships in what German submariners were calling the second happy time. Tankers, freighters, troop ships. The supply chain that was keeping Britain alive and feeding the Soviet Union was hemorrhaging from the American end. And in the middle of all of this, arriving fresh from the Baltic, brand new on its very first operational patrol, came a submarine that was different from almost everything else the Germans had at sea. U-215 was not a standard attack submarine. It was a Type 7D, one of only 6 ever built. The Germans designed the Type 7D for a specific purpose, mining. These boats carried the standard torpedo armament of the workhorse Type 7C that made up the bulk of the U-boat fleet. But amidships between the conning tower and the stern, they had 5 vertical tubes capable of carrying 15 SMA mines each. These were not small devices. Each SMA mine was a moored contact mine, designed to be laid in shipping lanes and harbor approaches to wait on the seabed and to detonate when a ship's hull made contact with its horns. They were cheap to deploy. They were nearly impossible to sweep completely, and a field of 15 of them, properly placed in a narrow shipping channel, could effectively close a major port. The target assigned to U-215 was Boston Harbor. Think about what that means for a moment. Boston in 1942 was one of the most important port cities on the eastern seaboard. Ships were moving through it constantly. Supplies heading to Britain, Lend-Lease equipment heading to the Soviet Union, troops moving both directions. Mining Boston Harbor would have caused chaos entirely disproportionate to the effort required to get there. And the Germans had a submarine on its way there, commanded by a 29-year-old Kapitänleutnant named Fritz Hoechner, with 15 mines loaded in those vertical tubes, and a crew of 48 men who had trained for this mission for 7 months. Hoechner was an experienced sailor, but an inexperienced submarine commander. He had joined the Kriegsmarine years earlier and worked his way up through surface ships, minesweepers, destroyers, before making the transition to U-boats. U-215 was his first and only submarine command. He was not a famous ace. He didn't have a string of tonnage kills to his name. He was a competent officer, assigned to a specialized mission that, if he pulled it off, could have had real consequences for the Allied war effort on the American coast. He departed Kiel on the 9th of June, 1942. 4 days into the voyage, a British aircraft found him in the North Sea and bombed the boat. The attack damaged U-215, but didn't sink it. Hoechner assessed the damage, made repairs at sea, and kept going. He was still going toward Boston. But then something happened that changed everything. And it happened not in a harbor, not in a minefield, not in the endgame of the mission. It happened on the 3rd of July, 1942, in heavy fog, on the Georges Bank south of Nova Scotia, with 15 mines still undeployed in those vertical tubes. It happened because of a Liberty ship loaded with something the Soviets desperately needed, and an escort vessel armed with depth charges, and a captain who had no idea his next decision would seal the fate of every man under his command. I want to stay with the summer of 1942 for another moment before we get to the attack, because the fog is important. The Georges Bank is a shallow, relatively flat area of the continental shelf south of Nova Scotia, covering roughly 350 miles east to west. It is one of the richest fishing grounds in the world. It is also famously unpredictable, cold Labrador current water meeting warmer water from the Gulf Stream, generating fog banks that can drop visibility to near zero in minutes. Fishermen have been navigating it, and respecting it, and dying on it for centuries. In the summer of 1942, it was also a transit zone for convoys moving cargo from Halifax and Boston toward Britain, and for U-boats hunting those convoys. Convoy BX-27 had assembled at Boston and was northbound when U-215 found it. The convoy's destination was Halifax, where the ships would join the larger transatlantic convoys heading across the ocean. Among the vessels in the convoy was the SS Alexander Macomb, a Liberty ship, less than a year old, on its literal maiden voyage. The Macomb was carrying 9,000 long tons of cargo, Sherman tanks, P-38 Lightning fighter aircraft, explosives, and general military supplies, all of it destined ultimately for the Soviet Union under the Lend-Lease program, equipment that Stalin's armies were waiting for. The attack came at approximately 3 in the afternoon. U-215 had been tracking the convoy through the fog. Hockner lined up his shot and fired a torpedo at the Macomb. It struck the starboard quarter, the aft right side of the ship, and detonated in the cargo. The Macomb was carrying explosives. The secondary explosion was enormous. Fire engulfed the stern almost immediately. Of the 66 men aboard, crew and armed guards, 10 were killed in the attack. 56 survived, rescued from lifeboats and life rafts by the convoy's escorts. For those 56 men, the story was dramatic, but it ended with survival. For the 48 men aboard U-215, the moment they fired that torpedo was the moment their own clock started counting down. HMS Le Tiger was a British anti-submarine trawler, a converted fishing vessel, small and unglamorous, with a crew of men who had been fishermen before the war. Its commanding officer was a temporary lieutenant named Colin Arthur Hoodless, working from a ship that cost a fraction of a destroyer and carried depth charges and an attitude toward German submarines that can only be described as determined. Le Tiger had been escorting this convoy in the fog, and the moment Hockner's torpedo connected with the Macomb, Hoodless turned his ship toward the contact. What followed was a short, brutal and decisive anti-submarine attack. Le Tiger dropped depth charges. They detonated at the depth where U-215 was running. The submarine went down. Oil came to the surface. Wreckage, the standard signatures of a kill. Le Tiger was credited with the sinking and went back to work. Hockner and his 47 crew members were gone. The mission to mine Boston Harbor was over. But the submarine was not gone. Not in the way that matters for this story. The submarine settled to the bottom of the Georges Bank, 82 meters down, on the sandy seabed at the edge of Canadian territorial waters, and there it stayed. For 62 years. That depth, 82 meters, is important for a reason that isn't immediately obvious. It's deep enough that the wreck was beyond the range of recreational diving in 1942. Deep enough that trawl gear could sometimes clear it without snagging, and deep enough that it essentially vanished from the historical record once the wartime action reports were filed. But it was also shallow enough that the cold, dark water at that depth preserved the submarine in a condition that nobody expected when they finally got there. Now here is the detail about the discovery that most accounts don't tell you properly. The idea of looking for U-215 didn't start with a government program or a university expedition or a funded oceanographic survey. It started with fishermen's complaints. Fishermen working the Georges Bank had been snagging their nets on something for years, decades, actually, in the area where the historical records placed the sinking. They'd lose gear, come up with bent metal, report it to harbor masters who filed it away. Those reports accumulated over time and eventually made their way into survey data held by the Bedford Institute of Oceanography in Nova Scotia. Meanwhile, in roughly 1997, a diver named Richie Kohler started looking into U-215. Kohler had become famous, or would become famous, after the book Shadow Divers was published, for his role in identifying U-869, the so-called U-215, a German submarine found 60 miles off the New Jersey coast that no one could identify for years. That story, told in Robert Kerson's book, made Kohler one of the most recognized names in wreck diving. But the U-215 project started before any of that, and it stayed in his files for years while he worked on other expeditions. In early 2004, through a maritime attorney named Peter Hess, Kohler connected with Mike Fletcher. And this is worth spending a moment on, because when the internet repeats this story, Fletcher is sometimes listed without context, and the implication is occasionally that the expedition was some kind of amateur outing. It wasn't. Mike Fletcher is one of Canada's most credentialed professional divers, with more than 4 decades of underwater work behind him: commercial diving, offshore oil and gas, ship salvage, marine construction, underwater cinematography. He had been lead diver and underwater cameraman on The Sea Hunters, the National Geographic and History television series developed with best-selling author Clive Cussler and his organization NUMA. He had participated in the discovery of the Mary Celeste off Haiti. He knew exactly what he was doing. Fletcher brought the project to Econova Productions in Halifax, which was producing episodes of The Sea Hunters, and the U-215 search became a funded expedition with a camera crew. In June of 2004, Fletcher, his son Warren, and a side-scan sonar operator named Vince Capone sailed from Gloucester, Massachusetts to survey the area where the historical records and the fishermen's data both pointed. They found several promising contacts, but they needed better weather, better equipment, and the right team to confirm what they had. In July of 2004, they were back. The vessel was the Ryan Atlantic II, a 140-foot lobster boat out of Shelburne, Nova Scotia, captained by Percy Cox. The team included Kohler, both Fletchers, marine archaeologist James Delgado, and the camera crew. They were working against the clock. Diving days in that area are limited by weather, current, and visibility, and they had a finite number of attempts before the season would close them out. This is the kind of research, not just the historical facts, but the human story of how these discoveries actually happen, the equipment failures and the weather windows, and the people who put years into an idea before it pays off. That makes this channel worth following. Subscribing means you'll be here for the next one. On the last dive of the last day, Richie Kohler went down. He descended through 82 meters of dark North Atlantic water to a seabed he had been thinking about for the better part of 7 years. And what he found was not a pile of scattered wreckage, not a crushed hull, not the kind of debris field you often find when a submarine has been depth-charged into destruction and then spent 6 decades rusting apart. What he found was a submarine that had come to rest largely intact, listing 45 degrees to port, leaning heavily to one side, but structurally coherent, with its hull recognizably, unmistakably that of a Type 7 submarine. And when he located the amidships section, the distinctive feature that would confirm the identification was right there: the 5 vertical mine tubes. Only one Type 7 variant had those, Type 7D, one of 6, one of which had been sunk in this exact area on the 3rd of July, 1942. He tied his tagline to the hull and came up. They had found it. In the days that followed, divers went down repeatedly to document the wreck, and the picture that emerged from those dives is what makes U-215 genuinely extraordinary among known U-boat wrecks. The hatches were sealed, the wreck was not breached, not opened by the sea in the way that many wrecks at this depth eventually are, not collapsed, not scattered. Cold water and low oxygen at that depth had slowed corrosion to a fraction of what it would have been in warmer, shallower water. The submarine was lying there in the dark, like a sealed container, which is exactly what it was. And through the opening of one of the 5 mine tubes, the aftermost one, whose outer cover had been blown off, most likely by Latiga's depth charges, you could see inside. There was a German SMA naval mine visible in the tube, still in its housing after 62 years on the seabed. The other 4 tubes were sealed. Their mines were presumably still inside. Think about what that means for a moment. This is a submarine that was on its way to lay 15 mines in Boston Harbor in July of 1942. It never got there. It was sunk before it could deploy a single one. And those mines, every single one of them, went to the bottom with the boat. 62 years later, divers could look through a broken tube cover and see one of them still waiting. The explosives inside SMA mines degrade over time. Picric acid, which was used in many German ordnance filler compounds of the era, becomes increasingly sensitive as it crystallizes with age. It doesn't necessarily become safe, it potentially becomes more sensitive to shock. The Canadian government was notified of the discovery, and there was immediate discussion about the status of the wreck as a potential hazard to navigation and as a war grave. The decision was made to leave it alone. Mike Fletcher was explicit about this when he talked to CBC News after the discovery. The wreck belongs to the German government under sovereign immunity law. It is customary to leave a warship undisturbed, and there are live mines inside. It has been left alone ever since. Now I want to go back to something I mentioned at the beginning and haven't fully addressed yet, something about this particular mission, and what it tells us about the Battle of the Atlantic in a way that the standard narrative often misses. Most people who know anything about the U-boat war know the broad strokes: German submarines in the mid-Atlantic, wolf packs attacking Allied convoys, a campaign that came closer to severing Britain's supply line than almost any other German strategy of the entire war. That story is real, and it's important. But the campaign in North American coastal waters in 1942 was a different beast, quieter, less glamorized, and in some ways more alarming. U-boats weren't just sinking ships off the American coast. They were doing it with practical impunity for months at a time. They were doing it close enough to shore that residents of coastal towns could sometimes see the fires from sinking tankers, and some of them, like U-215, were attempting things that went beyond straightforward tonnage sinking into something more strategic. Mining Boston Harbor was not a sure thing. The Germans knew that, but it was possible. The Boston approaches are relatively narrow. 15 properly placed mines in the main shipping channels could have created chaos, forcing time-consuming sweeping operations, diverting traffic, delaying convoys at precisely the moment when every day of delay cost lives in Britain and the Soviet Union. The Type 7D boats were not numerous, only 6 were built, and U-215 was only the second of them deployed operationally. But the concept was sound. The Germans were thinking about the ports, not just the ships. Hochner knew this. He had been trained for it. He had taken his damaged boat through the North Sea bombing and kept going, because the mission was worth completing. And on July 3, 1942, he found a convoy and torpedoed a ship carrying Sherman tanks and Lightning fighters bound for the Soviet front. And that single act of aggression, that single torpedo, called down the response that killed him and everyone aboard. This is the part of the story that gets to me, and I want to say it plainly. 48 men went down with U-215. Some of them were probably very young. Some of them had been at sea since the submarine first commissioned in November of 1941. Some of them may have been seasoned sailors. Some of them barely trained. We don't know their individual names in most cases. We don't have letters they wrote home, or photographs, or accounts of what they were thinking on the Georges Bank on a foggy July afternoon when the depth charges started falling. They are just the complement, the 48 men the war log records as lost. But here is what we do know. When Richie Kohler descended to that submarine in 2004 and looked at it for the first time, those 48 men had been on the seabed for 62 years, not in a mass grave, not scattered across a debris field, sealed inside a steel hull with their mines and their equipment, and whatever personal possessions they'd brought on a submarine patrol, photographs, letters, books, the small objects that people take to sea because they matter. Sealed there because the hatches closed when the boat went down and the sea closed over them, and nobody ever came back. Kohler tied his tagline to the hull and came up to report the identification. The German government was notified. Canadian authorities were informed. The standard protocols were followed. And the wreck went back to being what it had been since 1942, 48 meters of steel on the bottom of the Georges Bank, with its mines intact, and its crew aboard, and the fish moving around it in the dark. There is a footnote to this story that I think deserves to be said out loud, because it sits at the intersection of everything this submarine represents, and everything the war in Canadian waters actually cost. The Battle of the Atlantic was not fought only in the mid-ocean. It was fought in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, where German submarines traveled so far upriver that they were sinking ships within sight of the Quebec shore. It was fought off Cape Sable Island, in Nova Scotia, where fishermen in small boats watched U-boats surfaced in broad daylight. It was fought in sight of Halifax Harbour, close enough that on Christmas Eve of 1944, a German submarine torpedoed and sank a Canadian minesweeper within 2 miles of the Halifax approaches, close enough that the explosion could be heard in the city. That was HMCS Clayoquot, and 33 men died. And 4 months after that, on the 16th of April 1945, 3 weeks before the German surrender, a German submarine sank HMCS Esquimalt off Halifax with the loss of 44 men, the last Canadian warship lost to enemy action in the entire war. Less than a month before Germany surrendered. The war in these waters did not wind down gracefully. U-215 is part of that story. Not the most famous part. Not the most dramatic part, if you measure drama purely by tonnage sunk or convoys disrupted. But it is one of the most haunting parts, because of what it contains and what it represents. A submarine on its way to mine a major American harbor, stopped before it could do so by a converted fishing trawler crewed by men who had been fishermen before the war. A mission that failed so completely that every single mine came to rest on the seabed unexploded, and every single crew member died without setting foot on the objective, and the whole thing sat there for 62 years before anyone thought to look. What the divers found in July of 2004 wasn't just a shipwreck, it was a sealed record of what the war looked like from inside a German submarine on a specific day. July 3, 1942. At the moment, everything went wrong. The equipment that was aboard, the mines that were loaded, the ship that never arrived. That record is still down there, 82 meters beneath the surface of the Georges Bank, in the dark, in the cold, waiting. The mine in that open tube is still there too. The men who went down in what should have been the Battle of the Atlantic's opening chapter in Canadian waters. The U-boats that hunted the Gulf of St. Lawrence and the waters off Nova Scotia throughout 1942 are remembered mostly in the records of the ships they sank, not in memorials to themselves. But the story of what Canada and the United States were actually up against in those coastal waters, and how close the Germans came to making things considerably worse, is one that the wrecks tell more honestly than any official account. U-215 tells it from the other side, from inside the hull of the attacker, sealed and silent on the bottom, with its mission unfinished and its crew still aboard. If you want to understand how the Allies finally turned the tables on the U-boat campaign in the North Atlantic, not in the coastal waters, but in the mid-ocean, in the Wolf-Pack battles of 1943 that decided who would control the supply lines, that story is the one that comes next, and it is right here.